Let's talk about your Miranda rights. A lot of you have your Miranda rights confused based on what you see on TV. First of all, an officer is only required to give someone their Miranda rights when that person is under custody and when that person is under interrogation. Therefore, let's talk about what those things mean. First of all, what does custody actually mean under the law? So basically, someone is under custody under this two-pronged test. Number one, when someone does not feel like they can terminate the encounter with the officer. Therefore, when you're pulled over by the side of the road, for example, and you see the officer's lights pulling you over, that is a situation where you do not feel you can leave the officer's encounter. Secondly, of the two-pronged test of whether or not someone is under custody under Miranda is whether or not there is the same coercive environment. Like, for example, when an officer brings you to the station and questions you in that room about a crime. So those two things must be satisfied in order for someone to be under custody. Lastly, an officer must give Miranda warnings to a defendant if the officer is putting that person under interrogation. So, interrogation under the law basically means that the officer must know or have reason to know that when they question the person about a crime, is reasonably likely that the person will give statements, incriminating statements about that crime. That a defendant gets pulled over the side of the road, the officer smells alcohol and or marijuana and suspects DUI, and then the officer puts that person in cuffs. That is an example of being under custody. And then the officer brings that person back to the station or brings that person to the back of the patrol car, and that basically directly states that, hey, you are arrested for DUI. And the officer begins to ask that person questions about the crime. That is an example of being under interrogation because not only do you not feel like you're not free to leave because you're in cuffs, but also the officer is next asking you questions that will elicit an incriminating statement. Therefore, that is when the officer must give you Miranda warnings. And to be very clear, a Miranda warning is not to be verbatim, but the officer must say something like this. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can will be used against you in court of law. You have the right to the presence of attorney. And lastly, if you're not afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you if you so desire. Once the officer gives you those warnings, you have the option to invoke your right to remain silent or your option to invoke your right to the presence of a lawyer. So if you do not want your statements to be used against you, invoke your right to the Fifth Amendment.